I'm divorcing you, you're poor. Raise the kid by yourself. The harsh words spewed from Jacob, whom I had thought was kind before our marriage, made me bite my lip. He would dump the housework on me when I was exhausted from work and act all high and mighty, and now he was cheating. Moreover, both immediately after our marriage and now, all he ever talked about was money. I married you thinking you had money, but it turned out you didn't have any. I'll break it off with a woman like you myself, he said with a despicable smile, making me regret why I ever chose such a man. What does he think I am? At least, I decided in my heart that I must properly raise our child alone. Eventually, when my daughter Riley was born, I regained hope. I could never have imagined back then that the grown-up Riley would take such action. Does your company condone affairs? My name is Alice Wilson, I'm 43 years old and work as a nurse. I live with my 21-year-old daughter, Riley. I divorced 21 years ago, right when I was pregnant with my only daughter, Riley. I met my ex-husband, Jacob Smith, at work. Our relationship started when Jacob, a patient who had broken his leg and was hospitalized, passionately expressed his feelings for me, and we got married. Jacob was working at a tutoring center back then, still one of the younger instructors. Despite his age, Jacob seemed intellectual and had a calm demeanor. His confession of love sounded sincere. You've been so caring and kind, I've always felt better when you're around. It's like the room lights up, it's healing. I'd be happy to spend my life with someone like you. Would you consider dating me? I was so happy to hear Jacob's words that I finally accepted his feelings. Our dating period was filled with happiness. Jacob would frequently check in on me, comforting me when I was tired from work with his kind words. Thinking such happiness would last forever, I decided to marry Jacob. However, that happiness vanished almost immediately after our marriage. When I realized everything was an illusion, it was already too late. The Jacob who had been so kind before we married changed completely as soon as we began our life together. Looking back, it might have been triggered when we discussed our finances. What? This is all the savings you have? What a letdown, I'm disappointed. Wow, I made a mistake. I thought nurses had more money. I couldn't believe my ears. To hear such words from the person I loved most, whom I was about to start a life with. Indeed, at that time, I was burdened with repaying student loans. Compared to others my age, I had a relatively good salary, but I hadn't been able to save much. I had student loan repayments, so I didn't have much spare money. I earn more than most people my age, and once I've finished paying off the loans, I'll be able to save more. But Jacob's mood didn't improve. Instead, he called me a liar for not mentioning my student loans earlier and harshly criticized me. Talking about student loans, you mean you're just in debt? If I'd known, I wouldn't have married you. The problem is you pursued an expensive education despite being poor. If you're from the bottom, you should act like it and just work after high school. His words trailed off, becoming quieter towards the end. It was more like he was talking to himself than to me. The situation became more suffocating as Jacob avoided making eye contact. Why would you say something like that? Money is important, but that's not the only reason we got married, right? Didn't you love me? Jacob glanced up briefly but ignored my words. I still vividly remember how tears of frustration and sadness flowed. What was supposed to be the start of a happy married life turned out to be the worst beginning. Furthermore, as half a year passed since our marriage, Jacob became even colder. Our conversations were less than half of what they were during our dating period. When he was in a good mood, he would be all over me, but if he was in a bad mood, even a simple greeting would earn me a glare. Back when we were dating, Jacob used to go out of his way to buy me food and offer kind words whenever I said I was tired. But after we got married, Jacob, facing me exhausted after a night shift, would harshly tell me not to slack off on the housework. What's this? Just grilled meat again. Don't try to get away with such lazy cooking like steak. Acting like you can't even fulfill your duties as a wife, yet you're a nurse. I feel sorry for the patients under your care. To think I was deceived by such an incompetent woman. It's heartbreaking to be met with such unkind words despite trying my best to prepare meals. Even the menu he dismissed as just grilled involved marinating in advance to ensure it was delicious and serving it hot right before eating. I also prepared some vegetables for the side dish and another dish. Yet, still, I faced criticism. Similar snide remarks about laundry and cleaning were frequent. Just letting them pile up for a day or two would lead to being nagged about being a failure as a wife. Days like these made even someone as patient as me lose my cool. After all that, have you ever helped around the house? You say you have work, but so do I. I even work longer hours than you with all the overtime. Didn't we talk about my night shifts before we got married? Couldn't you show a little understanding? When I couldn't contain my frustration any longer and got angry, Jacob would just click his tongue and escape to another room or the bathroom. Since such incidents kept happening, I reluctantly relied on my real mother, asking her to help with household chores from time to time. However, my mother was still in her 40s and working hard, so I couldn't ask her to come over every day. Of course, I also did my best to balance both work and household chores. The stress of daily life and the exhaustion from work were heavy burdens, and there were times I cried from the hardship, yet somehow, Jacob would choose those moments to be kind. Alice, I'm sorry. I've been irritable from work and unfairly taking it out on you. It's my immaturity, and I'm reflecting on it. Here, a souvenir. I thought you'd like this, so I couldn't help but buy it. Saying so, Jacob would occasionally bring back notepads and small plush toys of characters I loved. It felt like a relief, thinking he remembered me when seeing these characters. Perhaps that's why. Despite the sorrow and hardship, I found myself unable to leave Jacob, and our precarious marriage continued. The tipping point for our shaky marriage came when I got pregnant. I've been feeling tired lately and sometimes have stomach pains. Maybe it's stress. Feeling changes in my body, I took a test recommended by a doctor at work. And found out I was about 4 weeks pregnant. The thought of a new life inside me was exhilarating. I hoped that having a child might change Jacob's attitude. That night, I told Jacob about the pregnancy. He merely raised his eyebrows slightly, a complex expression on his face. So, I can't push myself for a while. Sorry, but you'll have to bear with me for a bit. I added nervously, and Jacob nodded in agreement. I was happy, thinking that becoming a father would change him. However, I soon noticed something off about Jacob's behavior. He started carrying his cell phone around the house, checking it from time to time. Sometimes he'd even have it in his hand when coming out of the bathroom. I hadn't paid much attention before since I often came home later than him, but his returning home much later than his work hours ended was suspicious. There are often days when I come home much later than the end of my shift. Even considering overtime at the tutoring center, it was strange. As morning sickness got worse, I became sensitive to smells, which led me to notice a sweet, artificial scent on Jacob shortly after he got home. When I asked about the scent, Jacob casually said, "Oh, that's probably from my students. Some of them are pretty close, so it rubs off." Kids these days were all sorts of things. I was somewhat convinced, but it was odd that the scent was always the same. If it were from a variety of students, I'd expect to smell different fragrances. The explanation of scent transferring from multiple students didn't quite add up. Driven by my concerns, I finally decided to consult with my parents and hire a detective agency. Even though I prayed, "Please let my suspicions be unfounded," the truth was stark. Jacob was having an affair. What's more, the other woman was a former student he met at the tutoring center. She was only 18 years old. She had graduated from high school, but it was unclear when their relationship started. I was shocked and instinctively placed my hand on my stomach. I didn't yet know whether the baby was a boy or a girl. But if it were a daughter? The thought of my teenage daughter being approached by a married adult, it sent shivers down my spine. I also understood why he was always so concerned about money. Unbelievably, Jacob had debts amounting to several tens of thousands of dollars. He had the nerve to criticize me for my student loan repayments while he himself was hiding his debts. And the source of his debt was gambling, including slots. Even the plush toys he gave me were prizes from the slots. In that moment, my love for Jacob turned cold. After that, it was all about divorce, rushing for a divorce. When I confronted him with the investigation results, he admitted to the affair and became defiant. "I married you thinking you had money. But it turned out you didn't have any. I'm glad to divorce a woman like you." I couldn't contain my anger at his terrible attitude. I blamed myself for not realizing sooner and marrying him. When I demanded alimony, he agreed to pay in a lump sum. It turns out the woman's father works at a very successful company and is quite wealthy. She's really a good girl, willing to give me as much money as I need. She even said, I'll pay whatever it takes for you to divorce her and marry me. I'm divorcing you, you're poor. Raise the kid by yourself. Jacob said with a sneer. Seeing his despicable smile made me feel sick. The other woman was no better. Knowing full well he was married, yet still trying to lure him away with money. Still, the only thing precious to me was the baby in my belly. This child was mine alone. I resolved to protect and cherish this life at all costs. I returned to my parents' home, where I would give birth and raise my child with their support. Although I thought about refusing child support, I decided to accept it on the advice of those around me. Despite feeling disgusted at the thought, I demanded it, considering it a form of punishment for him who always talked about money. Surprisingly, Jacob accepted this without any fuss. Apparently with support from his affair partner's parents. A letter of apology for their daughter's actions came through a lawyer, but I tore it up, sickened by the hollow words. Every time I confirmed the deposit of child support, I felt a bitter tear. But I gritted my teeth thinking of my unborn child. Eventually, it was confirmed the baby was a girl, and the thought of meeting her became my only solace. But Jacob betrayed me again. Just a year later, the child support payments began to falter. When I called, he coldly snapped, "Are you demanding money?" I was astounded by his coldness. Consulting a lawyer got the payments restarted, but after repeated delays, I eventually gave up. Moving back to my parents' home allowed me to significantly reduce living expenses. With the savings, I could allocate more towards repaying my student loans each month. I decided to use the recently received alimony to aggressively pay off my student loans. Before long, my student loan was completely paid off, disappearing as if it had never been. Having paid off my student loans more than 10 years ahead of schedule, I breathed a sigh of relief, knowing I could live comfortably on my income alone. While my child was young, I could work just as hard as before with the help of my parents. This would surely lead to financial independence in the future. At this point, the discontinuation of child support felt like cutting off a bad tie, which oddly enough made me feel better. Through my lawyer, I communicated that I no longer needed child support and completely cut off all relations with Jacob. Afterwards, I safely gave birth to my daughter, whom I named Riley. She grew up to be very admirable. I considered living on our own when I had more financial freedom, but my parents, who adored their granddaughter, convinced us to stay, and we continued to live at my parents' home. No matter how exhausted I was when I came home, the warm love of my parents and the smile of my adorable daughter made it all bearable. Eventually, after graduating from high school, Riley was accepted into college to study nursing. "I want to be a nurse like you, Mom. I've always admired you working hard. You're my pride," my usually cool daughter said with a shy smile. Unexpectedly hearing these words from my daughter, whom I thought I had made feel lonely with my busy schedule, moved me deeply. There's nothing more gratifying than knowing she admired me enough to follow in my footsteps. Despite my ex-husband's betrayal, I felt truly happy to have raised my daughter. One day, Riley casually asked what her father was like. I hesitated, but Riley was no longer a child. I decided to open up about Jacob. After hearing everything, Riley seemed to ponder deeply with a stern look. "Hey, do you still have those documents from the detective agency?" she asked unexpectedly after hearing everything. Confused about why she would want them, I honestly replied that I thought they were thrown away but wasn't sure. As a junior in college, Riley suddenly announced she was going for a job interview. It was surprising considering it was time to start gathering information for future employment. I subtly inquired about her studies and job prospects, but Riley just smiled and said, "It's an important interview." With Riley so determined, I had no choice but to trust her. She was dressed in a suit and more determined than usual. I sent her off with her favorite breakfast. She left briskly, cutting through the wind. Along with my parents, now doting grandparents, we wished for Riley's success and happiness. I couldn't help but feel a bit smug inside that Jacob, who had never seen how beautifully and admirably she had grown, was missing out. In the afternoon, Riley returned home laughing cheerily. "Victory," she exclaimed, making a triumphant gesture. Surprised by how positive she felt, I listened to her story. She had asked the interviewer, "Does your company condone affairs?" Moreover, the interview was at a privately owned tutoring center. Riley had never mentioned wanting to be a tutor before. And her out-of-the-blue question baffled me. But Riley, with a bright smile, explained, Mom, you didn't throw away the investigation report. Grandma kept it safe, thinking it might be useful someday. I was curious about what that terrible man was doing now, so I went to the detective agency myself. That's how I found out he's currently working at that tutoring center. That clearly referred to the place she had her interview today. It was a different center from the one Jacob worked at when we were married, but it seemed he had moved there. Confused, I listened as Riley explained slowly. There were two interviewers. A young man mostly took notes while a brisk woman in her 50s, who appeared to be the one Riley had interacted with, conducted the interview. According to the website, that woman was listed as the director, so she must be the owner of the tutoring center. Riley noted, sitting poised at the dining table, slowly brewing a packet of tea. At the end of the interview, the tutoring center director posed the standard question. Do you have any questions for us? Feel free to ask anything, no matter how minor. Riley's response was that one line. Does your company condone affairs? At that moment, the director was taken aback, her eyes wide with shock. The young male employee taking notes also looked up, alternating his gaze between Riley and the director in confusion. Before anyone could ask why she posed such a question, Riley continued. Mr. Jacob Smith, who is employed at your company, had an affair 21 years ago with a former student of his, who was 18 at the time, despite having a pregnant wife. Furthermore, after the divorce, he has been delinquent in paying child support multiple times. However, it seems he is working here without any issues, which is why I asked this question. Riley had gone to Jacob's workplace and deliberately took an interview to confront him. The interview room was filled with a confused atmosphere over the past of Jacob, who was apparently considered a model employee. Mr. Smith? He was admired by the students, I can't believe it. As the director stood in shock, Riley laid out all the contents of the investigation report on the desk. Included were photos of a younger Jacob and his teenage affair partner entering a hotel together. Despite being over 20 years old, the documents, clearly bearing his name, provided irrefutable evidence. Additionally, Riley presented another piece of evidence my mom had kept. A bank account record showing the child support payments received. At the time Mr. Smith divorced, his ex-wife was pregnant. Here are the records of child support payments that were initiated. As you can see, payments were made monthly for a while but then became sporadic the following year. The ex-wife had to repeatedly request payments, eventually giving up. I see. But why do you have a record from 20 years ago? How do you know about this? The director asked, pale and almost whimpering. Perhaps already suspecting the answer. Riley calmly and with a cold voice replied. Because I was the child in Mr. Smith's wife's womb at that time. Hearing this, the director looked down, unable to utter a word. Meanwhile, the male employee beside her became visibly nervous, flipping through papers in a meaningless manner. In the somber atmosphere, Riley mercilessly continued. The woman who is now his wife and was a former affair partner was a student he taught at the tutoring center where he was employed at that time. So, does your company employ a man who had an affair with a teenage female student and abandoned his family? Are you saying your company tolerates married employees having relationships with students or alumni? After stating this, Riley fell silent. The investigation report clearly contained evidence of their relationship, though the exact start of the affair wasn't determined. Riley's reference to students or alumni suggests she suspected some relationship had existed while they were still at the tutoring center. Honestly, I had thought the same. I hadn't noticed until I was pregnant and started to cut back on work, but there's a high likelihood there was already a relationship or at least some special attention given before that. Otherwise, the quick divorce and subsequent remarriage would seem unnatural. Understood. We will take appropriate action. This concludes the interview. The director said, her voice lower than before, pressing her temples. Riley didn't leave immediately but stood close, staring intently at the director. Frowning, the director asked, "Is there something else?" Waiting for this, Riley spoke up again. One more question, how does your company view instructors encouraging students to gamble on slots? The director looked startled at the question. I would think the same. Caught in the fallout of our situation with Jacob, she was bombarded with one shocking revelation after another. I couldn't help but feel sorry for the director, considering her position. However, Riley remained unfazed, waiting for a response. Eventually, the director cleared her throat and replied. Of course, that's unacceptable. Not just in our company, but anywhere. It was the expected response, but Riley was satisfied. While confirming another envelope hidden under her jacket, Riley asked again for emphasis. Is that really true? It's unacceptable, right? The director, with an angered tone, responded, of course. That makes sense. That's the expected response from any decent person. However, it seems Jacob was far from decent. Then, unfortunately, I have another report to make. Mr. Jacob Smith was involved in playing card games with several high school students he taught, betting on candies and small change. Although the amounts were trivial, there was indeed an exchange of cash, as documented in a report with photos I received. The director exclaimed in shock, "What?" As Riley recounted with a hint of amusement, stirring her tea as if discussing a movie she had just watched. I listened to Riley's story, almost forgetting to breathe. Here are the documents for your reference. This is a copy, I hold the original. If no action is taken, I intend to report this matter to the families of the students in the photos myself. Thank you for conducting the interview, Riley said before leaving the interview room. A scream-like exclamation, "What?" from the female director echoed once more, but Riley had already left. I felt a chill thinking about how far Riley would go for overkill. The documents Riley left were from another private detective's envelope, containing a conduct report. Not satisfied with past reports, Riley had ordered a new investigation into Jacob and his wife's current behavior. I saw the report. Jacob had noticeably lost hair and looked like a significantly less impressive man. It seems he's no longer indulging in affairs with young women, though he frequents establishments with female staff. The gambling issue reportedly took place in a diner close to the tutoring center. Photos showed Jacob and several young people gathered around a table, closely examining cards. They were betting on poker games with stakes ranging from candies to small amounts of cash, from 10 cents to about $10 per game. While such small bets might not always be considered a crime, it's undeniably problematic behavior. And the report had more disturbing details. What has he done? Jacob was luring children into gambling. I was speechless. A detective had secretly spoken with the students, revealing that Jacob was the one who initiated the bets. The idea of leading students down the wrong path with a nonchalant demeanor was appalling. Not only had he not stopped gambling, but he was also approaching high school students himself, an outrageous lack of judgment. Moreover, Jacob had won money from these students multiple times. The student who lost the most had paid over $200 in less than a year. A significant amount for a high schooler. I sincerely hoped he would be held accountable. According to the investigation, Jacob's household finances seemed far from prosperous. His wife's family, which had covered the divorce settlement, was reportedly struggling after the parents retired, significantly depleting their assets. This strain appeared to have led to a difficult life and a strained marriage for Jacob and his wife, who had no children. Despite leaving me when I was visibly pregnant for her, their relationship ended up failing. It seems Jacob always prioritized his own pleasures. Ethics and affection probably don't mean much to Jacob. I can only imagine his current partner might regret their decision, just as I did that day. That's why I felt even less forgiving. Thinking about this scum made my mom sad. I was determined to get back at him. Riley said not my mom and me, but my mom. She emphasized her mother's suffering, not her own, suggesting she saw herself as having been raised happily by her grandparents and mother. I had always thought I made Riley suffer. There were many days I wasn't home until late, and especially when she was little, I couldn't give her the attention she needed. Reflecting on the past, there are so many things I wish I had done differently. Yet, hearing Riley confidently say she was raised happily truly made my day. Perhaps even more than the revenge investigation she carried out. I've grown to be proud of how smart and strong Riley has become. But a part of me couldn't help but worry, leading me to voice a concern. Isn't this going a bit too far? What if it affects your future? Riley responded with a calm sip of her tea, smiling beautifully. Then, she pushed her cup aside, propped her cheek on her hand, and looked up at me with a slightly amused, squint-eyed smile, reminiscent of the mischievous expressions she'd make as a little girl plotting some adorable prank. Don't worry, that tutoring center is just a small business run by an individual. I doubt they'd want to make this public, considering the scandal would be too detrimental for a learning center. And besides... Riley paused, breaking into a suppressed giggle, leaving me hanging and eventually prompting me to ask for the rest of the story. Lowering her voice as if sharing a top secret, she whispered. That tutoring center employs quite a few students from our school. Some seniors even landed jobs there after graduating, people I know well. So, everything that happens there is pretty much an open book to me. In fact, I learned about the gambling from a tip-off by one of them. They were really supportive, even promising to keep me updated on his antics, as well as any moves from the director's side. It's all about having the right connections. Networks are so important. I was speechless at my daughter's savvy, far exceeding my expectations. True to her word, Riley kept tabs on Jacob's downfall. First, he was summoned by the director and returned to the staff room hours later, looking utterly defeated. Pretending to sympathize, Riley's friend learned that he was berated for his decades-old divorce, mumbling about the embarrassment. He was annoyed by the persistent questioning about his current conduct, but it was his own doing. It's only fair that he continues to be doubted for his actions. Regarding the gambling, a stern reprimand followed. Initially, the high school students involved were interviewed, then actions were taken. After a stern warning, they received refunds from Jacob, who was also required to apologize to their parents. This seemed to have taken a significant toll on him, aging him considerably. Hearing this, Riley simply commented, "Serves him right." By the end of that school year, Jacob quietly resigned. Apparently due to disciplinary dismissal, lamenting the reduction in his severance pay. After all, a tutoring center is not a school. If one wants to leave, it's much easier to do so compared to leaving a school. As such, it seems Jacob was dealt with quite strictly due to the implications for the business. Not long after, Jacob and his wife divorced. The relationship, already frosty, was likely pushed over the edge by this scandal. Left alone, Jacob tried to find re-employment in the same industry but was rejected everywhere, wandering aimlessly. With such a reputation, it's no surprise no tutoring center or home tutoring company wanted to hire Jacob. It was an entirely predictable outcome. Now, he's in tatters, desperately working day jobs to get by. Riley informed me, marking the end of her reports. Comparing my happy family-surrounded life to Jacob's, the difference is laughable. The curtain closed on a revenge plot 21 years in the making, leaving me feeling as if a significant burden had been lifted. Years have passed since then, and now, I have a grandchild. Riley continued her education diligently after that interview, eventually becoming a nurse and securing a job at a hospital. There, she met a wonderful male nurse, her colleague, and they married. Last year, they welcomed their first child. Unlike my hardships with Jacob, Riley's husband is a modern, involved dad, taking paternity leave and eagerly participating in housework and childcare. I'm overjoyed that my dear daughter found such a sincere and kind partner. Riley, entrusting her child to her husband on paternity leave, has already made a part-time return to work, eager to regain her professional skills. I'm increasingly proud of my daughter's growth and resilience. I thought I'd feel lonely with Riley married and out of the house, but that hasn't been the case. Riley and her family live close enough that soup doesn't cool on the way over, visiting often. With my adorable grandchild to see, there's no time to feel lonely. I never imagined such a happy future in my younger days. While still working as a nurse, I look forward to enjoying my grandchild's growth.